Hey guys, what's up? So finally out with that video, and this is going to be more of a rant style video rather than on martial arts or something more structured. But you guys are probably noticing something a bit different. Yeah, these specs. One of the consequences of getting old. Yeah. My birthday just recently passed, and it's kind of funny that I got these the day right after my birthday. I already, obviously I ordered them before, and then they finally came in the day after my birthday. It's the Sunday, August 30th. So yeah. Yeah, and also the background. I think I finally got a decent recording setup. At least I hope it is. I'll find out after I record this how well the sound came out and everything. And of course you guys will let me know as well. You guys know I'm pretty much working with a shoestring budget here. This is hobbyist work. But yeah, today we're going to be talking a bit about Cyberpunk, or more to the point, how I feel that a lot of modern day so-called video game journalists, and I say so-called because so few of them actually do any real journalism, how many so-called video game journalists just don't seem to understand Cyberpunk. They don't get it. They don't really know what it's supposed to be about. And to be honest, a lot of fans I don't think really understand it either, considering some of the counter arguments that some people have been saying about Cyberpunk. And of course, you can't mention Cyberpunk these days without talking about Cyberpunk 2077, the game that's going to be coming out real soon, and I can't wait for it to come out. As a fan of the original RPGs and a fan of the genre, period, I can't wait for this game. And, there's been the game itself, as it's been developing, has been taking a lot of flack by certain self-righteous people who don't seem to really get what the genre is about, or, trying to find offense where there really isn't any, things like that. So I thought I would kind of touch on that a little bit here. Kind of touch a little bit about Cyberpunk first, like the genre itself. And then later on kind of talking to why I think a lot of people don't really get it on both sides of the argument. So, first, what exactly is Cyberpunk? Well, it these days is considered to be a subgenre of science fiction. It used to be kind of considered more of a type of literary movement, or like kind of a change in science fiction. All right, I'm not going to try to delve too much into the history of it, partially because I don't want this to be longer than I normally make them, and also because I don't want to butcher the history of it. I'm pretty sure some of you out there are more learned in this than I am, but I am going to try to do a very, very quick summary of things. So, before, when we had like science fiction, you had certain literary types like Asimov, people who would write, original science fiction wasn't necessarily what we would consider today to be like science fantasy, like stuff like Star Wars, or, like you got these huge freaking operas or epics in space that just so happen to have things like spaceships and high-tech things. Original science fiction, even though it was fiction, the writing tried to root itself in real science, but also like theoretical science, like, trying to come up with, like, they would write about futures, or they would write about technology, they would write about certain advances in humanity that seemed feasible or possibly plausible, but the focus wasn't so much on the science necessarily as it was about humanity itself. Many of these particular stories would delve into subjects such as, like, what does it mean to be human? What is consciousness? What are the merits of human society? What are the failings of that? And so on. Like, a lot of science fiction tends to hold a mirror to the reader and to the society that the reader is living in, and getting one to question things. This is why a lot of earlier science fiction tends to be the type of thing that, it tends to be some, I won't say necessarily overly deep stuff, but deep enough to have you going, like, asking certain questions. And of course, you'll have your pulp writers, you always will. But for the most part, earlier science fiction, and one of the things that a lot of people these days bemoan about science fiction is that in the earlier days it was a little bit more cerebral. But another thing about earlier science fiction is that it tended to be kind of utopian. Even with the stories where they, are going really deep into human psyche, human morality, ethics, things like that, you still tended to have these stories placed in these futuristic settings that were maybe not necessarily utopian, but definitely supposedly a better world, or better universe, or like, and again, I'm speaking in general terms. I know you're going to come up with exceptions, but generally speaking, these tend to have these societies that are at least in a better place than where we're at right now. I'm pretty sure we could successfully argue that. And then here comes this movement in this 1960s, 1970s that kind of goes against that. Instead of coming up with utopian storyscapes, instead of coming up with these settings that were, a better place to be, now we're coming up with these dystopian settings where, yeah, technology has advanced, but human life hasn't necessarily advanced along with it. And in fact, misery may possibly be even worse. Like, things are dysfunctional. Things are not necessarily good for mankind. The advancement of technology and science has not necessarily bettered humanity as a whole. And you find these sort of darker, grimmer stories that still touch on themes on what it means to be human, what is our morality, things like that, but not necessarily in a setting that would give one hope. And it seemed, some people would say that these particular stories kind of were rebelling against these sorts of, like, it's like, I guess, the difference between, say, a Star Trek story, which, even with all the themes and the conflict and the wars and things that can happen in Star Trek, it still more or less has a future that pretty much puts humanity and Earth, and our living standards in a more utopian life. It's a difference between something like that and, say, Aliens, where, it's a lot darker, grimmer, more cynical, that sort of thing. Like, that's the difference. In fact, you can kind of see a mirror between, like, it's kind of reminds me of parallels with that and mystery. You look at earlier detective stories, earlier mystery stories, and you tend to have protagonists that are more or less in higher society. Your Sherlock Holmes, right? Your Agatha Christie's. Agatha Christie's the author, but you know what I mean. You got these particular characters who, they're well mannered, well dressed, well spoken. They're living more or less in higher society, and the crimes that they're dealing with tend to happen in higher society. And it seems like these crimes that happen are irregular. Like, when they happen, it's like, oh, this is not the sort of thing that happens in this. This is abnormal. This is an aberration. We would never act this way. That sort of kind of thing. Then again, it depends. Certain Sherlock Holmes stories seem to slightly suggest the opposite. But whatever. I don't want to get too much into that. But you know what I mean. You get what I'm talking about. You tend to be in a setting that, all the characters, well, most of the characters, especially the main characters, you're dealing with nobility, you're dealing with higher class people, sometimes you're straight up dealing with royalty in certain earlier Sherlock Holmes stories. And then suddenly you get the noir tales, the darker, more grittier, down to nose type detective stuff, where now instead of the consulting detective, now you have the private eye. Now you got the guy who's living among those in, the alleyways, in the gutters, like, who's not necessarily living such a posh lifestyle, and whose circle of friends, who's the people that he mingles with, they're not high society at all. And the protagonist is much more rough, around the edges, much more hard-nosed, and receives a lot more hard knocks in life. And it seems kind of like a rebellion against that sort of higher, posher thing where, it's more down to earth. Cyberpunk kind of reminds me of that this sort of turn from this more shinier, polished version of science fiction, and now you get this more darker, grittier one that mirrors real life a bit more. It's more cynical. It's it's more down to earth. So we start seeing these particular stories. Like I said, you see this movement against this sort of like higher aspect of science fiction in the 60s and 70s. This is where you start seeing it. And the one thing that a lot of people can agree on, like, you can argue the first, or at least one of the first earlier or proto-cyberpunk stories, was Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? You should know that one. I mean, that's the story that later on got turned into Blade Runner. And Blade Runner ended up pretty much kind of being the template for what people would later on define as the look of cyberpunk. And Japanese anime in the 80s ran with this movie. They completely ran with it. And that it's funny how Japanese anime, in many ways, defined what we've come to expect these days as cyberpunk. You know, the neon lights, they're really on top. Like, you got these neon lights and these shiny billboards in this high class society, but right in the bottom of it, this grungy, dingy, dirty, overly dark alleyways, and people living in misery at the same time that, you know, they're playing around with shiny gadgets and they got bionics and things like that. The Japanese really ran with this with things like Akira and Bubblegum Crisis, and I'm trying to think of some other, you know, Ghost in the Shell, these sorts of like stories, and the look and feel of these things. They took a lot from Blade Runner. And of course, when you start getting into more of the internet aspects of cyber, because you can't, people think of cyberpunk, they think the neon lights, they think the dark city streets, the super urban sprawls. Another one, by the way, Judge Dredd's another what I would call proto cyberpunk. Again, you know, in the future, but the future is grim and dystopian, and you got these like super urban sprawls that, despite the fact that it's, you know, in the future and you got high technology, life is miserable. And things have gotten so out of control in terms of like trying to keep law and order that cops are pretty much judge, jury, and executioner. Kind of like today. But you you get this kind of weird mix where, like, basically a lot of these stories seem to come with this theme of all the high technology did not necessarily raise the standard of living for human beings, despite that constant myth we're given where when science and technology advance, so does the well-being of humanity. The funny thing is, real life doesn't really go that way. How many of you guys watching this right now, because I know many of you guys are pretty young, how many of you guys remember people saying how the internet was going to improve people's lives and that it was going to... Okay, here's a good one. How many of you guys remember when the internet had people saying that from now on information will be free? Like, there was this kind of free information movement, this free knowledge movement, where the internet is going to keep walls around, like education and knowledge, information, facts, all the walls that were keeping everyday people from that were knocked down from the internet. That's not necessarily true today, isn't it? These days, so much stuff is locked behind a paywall. They were saying the same thing about radio. They said the same thing about TV. Yeah, just, this is the type of thing that Cyberpunk addresses. So, and of course they're addressing more like what it means to be human, because you got stuff like, you know, Johnny Mnemonic, and, you know, you hear story and you start seeing things like hooking up your consciousness to the net, and you got Ghost in the Shell where it starts talking about like what exactly does it mean to be human. Like, if you turn flesh and blood into a machine, at what point do you stop being human and become a machine? How important is self-identity and consciousness? Are we better off being individuals, or are we better off being a collective? You look at the, you know, Ghost in the Shell, at least the movie Ghost in the Shell. Most people, when they think of Ghost in the Shell, they think of the movie, not the graphic novels, the manga. The movie itself, the original anime, I'm not talking about the freaking modern day live version of it. It's interesting what happens at the end of it, and the commentary that it's making about how much worth one's individuality really has. These are the sorts of things that, you know, again, tend to come up in science fiction. But the main thing I want to, again, I don't want to keep diving into what it means and all the different messages in the beginning. I might be butchering some things because I'm generalizing so much. But I'm basically trying to give you a rough estimate of how all of this developed, and what the themes and the look and the feel of this genre. It's basically a dystopian setting, a dystopian future where humanity itself is still living in misery. Power is being held only by a certain smaller group of people, the elite, usually the corporate elite. You know, governments have been heavily weakened, and it's corporations that run the show. Sort of like now, anyway. and the people themselves are trying to make ends meet, and even with all their fancy gadgets and, you know, the fact that they got bionics and you got all that type of stuff, they're still barely scraping out a living. Kind of like, nah. Anyway. I can keep going with that, but Now along comes the game, the original game, Cyberpunk 2020. It was Cyberpunk 2020, wasn't it? Because now it's Cyberpunk 77, but the original was Cyberpunk 2020. You guys finding that funny that it was 20? Anyway, I don't know why I suddenly forgot his name, even though I really shouldn't have, considering that he's one of the pioneers of the role-playing aspect of it. These days, when people think of Cyberpunk and RPGs, they think Shadowrun, but the original was Cyberpunk. No one actually has the name. The dude was a big fan of these earlier stories, and he liked the idea, like he liked the nightlife. It's sort of like, and I identify with this because I'm a night owl myself, and I used to, when I was living in New York City, because that's where I was born and raised, a lot of my times I spent, out at night, and there's something about the nightlife and the people who live it day to day. It's a certain vibe to it. Yes, it can be, grimy and some are miserable and you scraping out living, but there's a certain electricity to it, a certain realness to it that it's hard to put into words, but it's something to kind of appreciate. And he liked that atmosphere. He liked that kind of dark noir feel, especially with fiction. And he wanted a game to capture that feel, and that was this game. And the thing about Cyberpunk, and the thing about these stories, and the thing about the setting, again, whether you are well versed in Cyberpunk, or whether you just happen to know about the image of it, or whether you're influenced by the Japanese anime, which, earlier Japanese anime, which in many people's minds kind of defined Cyberpunk, like it was like the final, crystallizing of the image of it. Again, Bubbling Crisis, Akira, Ghost in the Shell. You could even argue maybe Dominion Tank Police. Like, these sorts of, this mix of high technology, but still day-to-day grimy living sort of, conditions. And the fact that you got like these mega corporations running things that you feel like you can't really do much of anything about. All you can really do is just try to eke your own living in it. He wanted to capture that in the game, and he made the game. And this is where we get into where I feel that journalists who are trying to criticize a new game coming out just don't freaking get it. They look at, for instance, I remember when the game was really starting to take shape, because this game's been in development for a very long time. I've been waiting for this game for a very long time, ever since that first trailer. Remember that first trailer that came out a long time ago with that song Bullets? And it took us by storm. This was in the middle of when The Witcher was still, it just dropped, and Witcher 3 I think had just dropped, and everybody's going ape shit about it. For good reason, because it's a really good game. I haven't even played it, but I've seen it in action. I know it's a good game. And everyone was going crazy about it. And when, like, many years later, when we finally started seeing some real, like, gameplay stuff, or, we're getting more of an idea of what the game was going to be like, and they showed us that first trailer where V is busting into the apartment to try to rescue that one woman who was apparently being caught up by, like, choppers who were trying to, like, take her for parts and things. Right away, people had criticisms. Why does she have to be naked though? Why are people like being portrayed in this way? And then later on, when they found out about the gangs, they're calling them animals. This is disrespectful to minorities. Like, you guys just don't fucking get. You had like, I think the thing that really, I was already getting annoyed by what a lot of journalists were complaining about. The fact that this is a grimy world. This is a world where, despite the fact that it's in the future, the worst of humanity is still on display, even more so, because what's ruling the place is corporate greed. It's corruption. Those are the main things. That's the atmosphere of freaking Cyberpunk. It's not, it's not all fairies and, sunshine and roses here. But, I think that what really capped it off for me was a few months ago when, because of the crap going on in the U.S. right now with police brutality, being put to the forefront again, though, well, this year it's really exploded. People are finally, like, taking a bit more of a serious look at it. You then had journalists, well, so-called journalists, then going, maybe they should tone down the way they are in the game, like make the police a lot less violent. Are you fucking kidding me? And again, this is me talking here. You know where I stand on the issue currently. But this is Cyberpunk. living in a place where you're having to deal with an oppressive elite that doesn't think twice about snuffing your life out because it means nothing to them, and having, a group to help enforce that type of rule, that's a big part of what Cyberpunk's about. Dealing with this sort of oppressive regime. Dealing with this, like, figuring out what it means to be human and trying to eke out some type of existence while living under these sorts of conditions. That's the whole freaking feel of it. It's like asking for a detective noir story without, the private detective constantly being harassed by the average police officer. It's like, come on now. Or, the certain cliches that you have of noir where the guy, like, every now and then gets bounced around in the alley because he's asking too many questions. Like, these are the sorts of things that you kind of expect. I'm not saying you can't put a twist on it, and I'm not saying you need to constantly be a slave to cliches, but there's certain things that you don't take out, otherwise it's not what it's trying to be. You know what I mean? Like, there's certain things that we've now more or less come to understand is cyberpunk. And these darker themes and these darker themes and this darker dystopian future, that's cyberpunk. That's a major part of it. To then say tone that down, what the hell are you here for? If that's not your thing, then you don't like cyberpunk. Please leave. You know what I mean? Like, don't criticize something you don't freaking understand. Learn about it first, then criticize it. But if you at least understand it and then have a problem with the messages that it's conveying, that's one thing. But if you're just simply criticizing it for the sake of it, saying that, why does this have to be in there, and you don't know what it is. Okay, let's, for instance, a good critique of Cyberpunk, not that I would agree with it, but I would say a good critique because they're at least showing that they understand it, is people going, why do they always, can't they, they're showing corporations to always be evil. And not all corporations have to be evil. You can have more benevolent ones. You have certain ones that are neutral. They aren't necessarily all about greed. It's just that that's the way it is. But maybe they could be trying to better things. And you can make an argument off of a philosophical or an ideological basis of not all capitalism is wrong. And you can, make a corporation surrounded by other corporate ones that's trying to change things. Why can't they do that in Cyberpunk? Why does this always have to demonize it? That would be a more interesting critique, because you're getting it to the heart of one of the themes of Cyberpunk, namely the greed and corruption of the elite. By the way, and this is where I start now flipping things. Not only do a lot of so-called game journalists not understand Cyberpunk, but I think a lot of so-called gamers themselves, when they're critiquing journalists, they show their ignorance. Because I will see people saying things like, they want this game to be political. It's not political. And they even got even the guys making the game tried to make that argument, and then they had to backtrack a bit. Because, like, at one point, you had the gamers going, well, it always amuses me, people going, these games aren't supposed to be political. It's not political at all. Why do you always got to put politics in my games? It's not political at all. Almost any work of art you do is going to have some bit of your ideology in it, and it's going to have some statement of politics in it, whether you like it or not. Saying that something, a statement, a work of art, or something where you put your own views in there has nothing political in it is absolutely and positively stupid. It's completely ignorant. It also doesn't mean that just because something happens to have a certain political ideology in it doesn't mean that you can't enjoy it either. Conan the Barbarian is one of my favorite freaking movies. Partially because I like the Conan stories, period. God, I love the Conan. Jeez. And also partially because, Arnold Schwarzenegger goes, was he the best Conan in terms of portraying the original character from the books and the stories? No. But as far as an interesting character in the movie, and just the themes of the movie and the action and all that, it's still one of my favorite freaking movies of all time. I quote it all the freaking time. It's awesome. But there's a certain political message in that movie. It's not super overt, but it's there. If you knew there isn't, you mean to tell me a movie where the bad guy happens to be running some type of cult where the people all look like hippies and they got flowers around them and all that type of stuff, talking about throw down your arms and return to the earth and be peaceful and loving. And you also had one of the head priests wanting to have, there are overtones of him wanting to have homosexual relations with Conan as he's infiltrating the camp before he gets discovered. And they make all these people look like bad guys or ignorant or stupid. And the good guys are all these super alpha type dudes who fuck all this peace and shit war. You don't think that's not a political statement? Some of you guys are really naive out of a sense of like willful ignorance. Now, I happen to not agree with that particular message. Doesn't stop me from enjoying the movie, because the movie's awesome. I really like Conan. Some of its portrayal of melanin-saturated people is not exactly all that great. Is it going to stop me from enjoying the story? No. Can I recognize the problematic elements in it? Sure, but it's not going to make me hate. You know what I mean? Like, you can appreciate it for what it is. Same thing with Cyberpunk, and the same thing with this game. There are going to be certain elements in there. And one of the things that you cannot take away from a lot of Cyberpunk stories is the theme of corporate corruption and how it F's everything up. The bad guys in a lot of these stories, and especially in the games, are corporations focused more on profit than people, and people are expendable to the point where in Cyberpunk the expendability of human life is now just accepted. Remember one of the latest trailers that we saw in 77? The way you're going to get notoriety as a regular street dweller is dying in a spectacular fashion. Then you begin to get well known. Then they make a drink, they name a drink out of you. It's like, oh, this guy, he did this and got fucked up. Now we got this cool drink named after him. Isn't he a legend? Not overcoming the corruption, not living a long life and being successful. No. Just living fast, dying young, and burning out brightly. That's the value of life in this particular scenario, and it's just accepted. And, I mean, look at the life paths that you have. You have 3 particular life paths, and one of the corporal one, you straight up basically being told living the life of a corporal is living the life of an asshole. And you yourself can be taken out at any time because someone else may be higher up than you and might be using you to benefit themselves. This hierarchical situation where your life is worth less than the one above you, and they can use you for their profit and gain at any time, and the entire structure of their life, their society, is set up this way. This is a huge indictment on corporate life, on whether you want to admit it or not. This is a bit of an indictment on capitalism and postmodernism itself. You can't get away from that. Now, it's funny how CD Projekt Red tried to go and be, oh, this game's not political. I know there must have been people looking at them like, seriously. And then they kind of had to backtrack a bit. We're not making a political statement. This is more of a political thesis. You know what a thesis is. They're dodging around because they want to sell this game and they don't want to upset their customers. So they have to say this sort of thing to kind of appease them. So you gotta like come up with these weasel words to try to twist things around slightly to like, no, we're not making it. Look, they may not trying to be overtly political with their game. Maybe that's what they're trying to say. Like, we're not trying to straight up say this is this and this is what we believe. But just because of the nature of the genre itself, it's going to make a particular statement. It's presenting a certain ideology. It's through that ideology that you have your setting. Whether you agree with it or not, that's the ideology on display. And people playing these games need to understand this. Just because it happens to bring up something that they themselves don't want to think about or uncomfortable with doesn't necessarily mean it's not there. And the other thing that they have to understand, you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't call games art and then complain when that art makes a statement. Good art always makes a statement, whether you agree with that statement or not. If you cannot critique it on its statement, it's not art. This, by the way, and I'm kind of going off on a tangent, this is one of the reasons why, even though I do not agree with her, like, at all, I didn't necessarily hate Sarkeesian when she started criticizing games. When she first started criticizing them, it was apparent to me that she didn't really understand games. But at the same time, I'm like, okay, now we can call games art, because that's pretty much how she was critiquing it. She didn't understand the art, but she was still critiquing it as art because she was talking about the themes. She was talking about the messages that she thought were in there. She's not simply talking about games purely as a product. Are the controls good? Do the graphics look snazzy? This thing looks like it was made 3 years ago. If that's the only way you can critique games, you're not critiquing it as art. If, however, you can look at a game and go, and this happens to be what it's saying about the current state of humanity, now you're critiquing it as art. And then, of course, you can get into debates on whether that message is really there or not, or whether that message actually has any merit in today's world. If you are afraid of that certain critique, you can't call games art. Sorry, can't have your cake, you need it too. You want games to be respected as a serious medium? This is the stuff that's going to come with the territory. Grow up and deal with it, or stop trying to call it art. Anyway, Cyberpunk is one of those things that it's not meant to be pretty. So the so-called game journalists who wanted to be all, make it a softer game, they don't get it. Why are these gangs being portrayed this way? That's the setting, and you're reading way too much into what they're supposed to be about. It's, and not... we happen to see certain things in real life. Even in real life, you'll see certain people associate themselves with stuff that people on the outside may think is demeaning. How many people, when they're together, they call themselves things like, yeah, we're the raw dogs. We're dogs. We're vicious animals. Are they demeaning themselves, or are they trying to link themselves to a certain image that to them gives them a certain type of strength? Almost totemistic in a way. You associate yourself with certain themes or certain animals or certain ideas that give you a sense of mental strength, give you a sense of emotional, like, yeah, we're that tough, we're that this, we're that. So many groups do that. Certain gangs do that. Certain societies do that. Does that mean they're demeaning themselves? So when you happen to have a game in the game, you have a gang in the game calling themselves animals, it's not the freaking developers saying, oh, we think these people are animals. Hell, the dude himself said that he explained what it was. And they still try to misconstrue it. I sometimes, and now I'm going off on another tangent, I sometimes wonder if the reason why many of these journalists were attacking the game, there's no proof of this, but considering how much butt they were kissing on games from companies like EA, which all they were doing was fleecing the people, and then you suddenly have this game that people couldn't wait for coming from a company that most people respect because for the most part they don't do a lot of the abuses of other game companies. We gotta trash this thing. We gotta trash this company. I sometimes wonder if that's what's going on. I don't 100% believe that, but I couldn't help but wonder that. Anyway, yeah, I'm now rambling, but I hope you guys kind of see what I'm trying to touch at here. Cyberpunk, again, it's a grimy, it's a somewhat cynical, it's a darker subgenre of science fiction, and it touches on themes that aren't pleasant. It explores aspects of humanity that aren't comfortable to deal with. And it holds up a darker mirror to humanity than traditional science fiction does. It not only forces us to look at what it means to be human, but, in a more darker way, having us explore some of our darker natures, but it also makes us look at our current society a lot more closely than I think traditional science fiction does. Because it shows us a world that, even though it's way in the future, the ethics and morality that we still cling to today is still there. And all it has done was taken the advancements of technology and science for its own gain. And it's just simply saying that this is the result of that. This is where you push it along. And it should not be surprising to anyone who's been awake in the room that this image was solidified in the 80s. And anyone who's been paying attention to history knows how things developed in the 80s. And the backlash that was made against the 70s and before that, and what we ended up with. The bigger rise of Wall Street and corporatism, the so-called trickle-down economics. It's interesting that we suddenly saw an explosion of cyberpunk-themed media during that time period. Just something to think about. It's also one of the reasons why I can't wait for this game. Anyway, hope you guys got something out of this. I know this was a really long one, but hope you gave you guys something to think about, something to discuss. And I will probably have another talky type one. And don't worry, I got that sort of review coming out soon. The other, because remember that thin one came in, so I got to review that. It's testing nicely, by the way, but it's a bit more. It's a different beast than what I thought it would be. Let's just put it that way. It's an interesting sword. Anyway, hope you guys enjoyed this, and I'll catch you guys later.